What drives a man to become death incarnate on the battlefield, destroying hundreds of enemy vehicles, while his own nation crumbles around him? Picture the Eastern Front in 1944, where the German Wehrmacht was in full retreat before the Soviet juggernaut. Amid the chaos and carnage, certain tank commanders achieved kill counts so extraordinary that they seemed impossible, almost mythical. These men claimed to have destroyed not dozens, but hundreds of enemy tanks, transforming themselves into legends whispered about in both fear and admiration. When the world learned of their records after the war, many were stunned. How could individual tank commanders achieve such devastating effectiveness? Were these claims propaganda, exaggeration, or genuine reflections of skill and circumstance combining in the crucible of total war? The story of history's deadliest tank commanders is not simply a tale of military achievement. It is a complex narrative intertwining technological innovation, tactical brilliance, desperate circumstances, and the moral ambiguities of serving evil regimes with exceptional competence. These men, primarily German tank aces fighting on the Eastern Front, operated in an environment where the stakes could not have been higher and where every engagement might be their last. They developed techniques that maximized the advantages of superior German tank technology and gunnery training while exploiting the numerical superiority and often inferior tactics of their Soviet opponents. Their achievements, measured in destroyed enemy vehicles, represented the apex of individual combat effectiveness in armored warfare. Yet beneath the stunning statistics lie uncomfortable questions. These tank aces served Nazi Germany, fighting to extend Hitler's genocidal empire. Their tactical brilliance prolonged a war that killed tens of millions and enabled atrocities that rank among humanity's darkest chapters. Can we acknowledge their professional competence without celebrating the cause they served? How do we contextualize records achieved in service of evil? And what do these extraordinary kill counts tell us about the nature of armored warfare, the reality of combat on the Eastern Front, and the human capacity for both excellence and moral compromise? The circumstances that produced these legendary tank commanders were unique to the Eastern Front's particular character. Nowhere else in World War II did armored warfare occur on such a massive scale, with such intensity, and with such dramatic disparities in training and tactical doctrine. German tank crews generally enjoyed superior training, better optics and fire control systems, and tactical doctrines emphasizing initiative and combined arms coordination. Soviet tank crews, particularly in the war's early years, often had minimal training, inferior equipment, and rigid tactical doctrines that emphasized mass over maneuver. These disparities created conditions where skilled German tank commanders could achieve extraordinary success rates, at least temporarily, before the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and improving Soviet capabilities overwhelmed German tactical advantages. The very concept of measuring military effectiveness through kill counts raises philosophical questions about how we quantify success in warfare. Unlike other professions where excellence is measured in positive achievements, buildings constructed, patients healed, students educated, military excellence in direct combat roles is measured in destruction, enemies killed, vehicles destroyed, territory controlled. This inversion of normal values reflects warfare's fundamental nature as organized violence in pursuit of political objectives. The tank commanders with the highest kill counts were the most effective at their profession, but that profession was killing. Reconciling admiration for professional competence with moral judgment about the purpose of that competence creates tensions that cannot be fully resolved. The psychological toll of this profession deserves consideration. Tank commanders who accumulated extraordinary kill counts spent months or years repeatedly engaging in lethal combat, watching enemy vehicles explode, knowing that each successful hit meant crew members inside were being killed or maimed. The mental compartmentalization required to function effectively in this role while maintaining sanity and moral sense must have been extraordinary. Some commanders apparently thrived in combat, finding meaning and purpose in their effectiveness. Others likely suffered psychological damage that manifested during or after the war. The human mind's capacity to adapt to extreme violence while continuing to function is both remarkable and disturbing. The advent of armored warfare transformed military operations in the 20th century, introducing a weapons system that combined firepower, protection, and mobility in unprecedented ways. Tanks first appeared during World War I as crude, unreliable machines designed primarily to cross trenches, and break through defensive lines. By World War II, they had evolved into sophisticated weapons platforms capable of independent operations, strategic maneuver, and decisive battlefield impact. The Germans, despite restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, developed advanced tank designs and, more importantly, revolutionary tactical doctrines for employing armored forces. The concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, emerged from German military thinking in the interwar period. Rather than using tanks primarily to support infantry attacks, as many armies envisioned, German doctrine emphasized concentrated armored thrusts that would penetrate enemy lines, bypass strong points, and drive deep into rear areas to disrupt command and control, logistics, and cohesion. This approach required well-trained crews, excellent communication systems, combined arms coordination with infantry and artillery, and commanders willing to accept risk and exploit opportunities aggressively. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, these tactics proved devastatingly effective, achieving victories so rapid and complete that they shocked the world. The theoretical foundations of blitzkrieg can be traced to military theorists like JFC, Fuller and Basil Liddellhart in Britain, and Heinz Guderian in Germany. These thinkers recognized that mechanization had fundamentally changed warfare's tempo and character. Armored forces could move faster and strike harder than traditional formations, creating opportunities for paralysis rather than mere attrition. The key was concentration of force at decisive points, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, and acceptance that rear areas might remain temporarily uncleared as armored spearheads drove deep into enemy territory. This represented a radical departure from World War I's methodical, attritional warfare. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, represented the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German and Axis troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, attacked across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial German advances seemed to validate blitzkrieg tactics once again, with vast encirclements trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and advancing hundreds of miles in just weeks. Soviet tank forces, despite significant numerical superiority, were decimated. Poor deployment, rigid tactical doctrine, inadequate training, and the disruption caused by Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s all contributed to catastrophic Soviet defeats. The Soviet purges of 1937-1938 had decapitated the Red Army's leadership, executing or imprisoning many of its most experienced and innovative commanders. Officers who survived learned that initiative and independent thinking were dangerous, that rigid adherence to doctrine was safer than tactical innovation. This cultural damage persisted into the war's early years, with Soviet commanders often afraid to adapt to circumstances or retreat from untenable positions without explicit permission. Combined with inadequate training for tank crews and obsolete tactical doctrine, these factors created conditions where German forces achieved spectacular initial successes despite facing numerically superior Soviet forces. Yet the Eastern Front would prove fundamentally different from earlier German campaigns. The vast distances involved strained logistics beyond breaking point. Soviet resistance, though initially ineffective, never collapsed completely. As winter approached, German forces found themselves overextended, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that grew stronger rather than weaker with each passing month. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought German advances to a halt and inflicted severe casualties on forces unprepared for Russian winter conditions. The strategic initiative began shifting toward the Soviets, who mobilized their enormous industrial capacity and manpower reserves for total war. The nature of tank warfare on the Eastern Front differed dramatically from operations in other theaters. In North Africa, tank battles occurred in open desert with excellent visibility and relatively small numbers of vehicles on each side. In Western Europe after D-Day, fighting occurred in terrain that often restricted armored maneuver and visibility. On the Eastern Front, battles occurred across vast spaces, in varied terrain ranging from open steppes to dense forests to urban ruins, and involving thousands of tanks simultaneously. The scale was unprecedented and would never be matched in subsequent conflicts. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 exemplified this scale. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, involved approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns attacking heavily fortified Soviet positions. The Soviets deployed over 5,000 tanks in defensive positions and counterattack forces. The resulting battle, particularly the engagement at Prokhorovka, involved hundreds of tanks in close quarters combat across relatively small areas. Tank losses on both sides were enormous, with the battlefield littered with burning hulks. Yet the battle's strategic outcome, a decisive Soviet defensive victory that marked the permanent loss of German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, mattered far more than tactical results of individual engagements. German tank development accelerated throughout the war, producing vehicles that were technically superior to most Allied tanks, but increasingly complex and expensive to manufacture. The Panzer III and Panzer IV that formed the backbone of German armored forces in 1941 gave way to heavier, more powerful designs. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, combined an excellent long-barreled 75mm gun with sloped armor, providing superior protection compared to its weight. The Tiger Wine, armed with the fearsome 80mm gun, could destroy enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The later Tiger II pushed the envelope further with even heavier armor and firepower. These vehicles provided German tank commanders with significant technological advantages, particularly in long-range gunnery. The Panther deserves particular attention as perhaps the best balanced German tank design of the war. Its sloped armor, inspired by the Soviet T-34, provided excellent protection while keeping weight reasonable. The long 75mm gun had excellent armor penetration and accuracy. Mobility was good for a 45-ton vehicle, with a powerful Maybach engine providing adequate speed and range. However, the Panther suffered from mechanical unreliability, particularly with its transmission and final drives, which required careful handling and frequent maintenance. In the hands of skilled crews who understood its capabilities and limitations, the Panther was formidable. With inexperienced crews who abused the mechanical systems, it broke down frequently. However, German tanks suffered from increasing mechanical complexity that made them difficult to maintain under field conditions. They were also produced in numbers far smaller than Soviet tanks. While Germany produced approximately 25,000 tanks of all types during the entire war, the Soviet Union produced over 60,000 T-34 medium tanks alone. This disparity meant that no matter how effective individual German tank commanders were, they faced an enemy that could absorb losses and continue attacking with fresh forces. The arithmetic of attrition warfare ultimately favored the Soviets. Soviet tank development followed a different philosophy. The T-34 medium tank, introduced in 1940, represented an excellent balance of firepower, protection, and mobility. Its sloped armor provided superior protection compared to equivalent thickness of vertical armor. Its wide tracks gave good mobility in mud and snow. Its 76mm gun, later upgraded to an 85mm, provided adequate firepower against most targets. Most importantly, the T-34 was relatively simple to manufacture and maintain, allowing mass production in factories that were sometimes under direct threat from German forces. The design philosophy emphasized quantity and reliability over individual vehicle sophistication. The T-34's design reflected practical Soviet understanding of what tanks needed to accomplish under Eastern Front conditions. Thick, sloped armor defeated most German anti-tank weapons in 1941-1942. Wide tracks distributed weight to minimize ground pressure, essential for operations in mud and snow that characterized much of the Eastern Front. The diesel engine, while less powerful than equivalent gasoline engines, was less likely to catch fire when hit and used fuel that was less volatile and easier to supply. The design sacrificed crew comfort and ergonomics for simplicity and manufacturability, accepting that individual tanks might be less effective but could be produced in overwhelming numbers. Soviet tank crews in the war's early years suffered from inadequate training, poor tactics, and inferior equipment compared to their German counterparts. Tank commanders often lacked radios, making coordination between vehicles difficult. Optical equipment for aiming and observation was inferior to German systems. Training periods were shortened to replace catastrophic losses, meaning many crews went into combat with minimal experience. Tactical doctrine emphasized rigid adherence to plans rather than initiative and flexibility. These factors combined to create situations where German tank crews, even when heavily outnumbered, could achieve significant success through superior skill and tactics. As the war progressed, Soviet capabilities improved dramatically. Training lengthened and became more realistic. Tactics became more flexible, incorporating lessons learned through bitter experience. Equipment improved, with later Soviet tanks like the IS-2 heavy tank and upgraded T-34-85 matching or exceeding German vehicles in various characteristics. Perhaps most importantly, Soviet commanders at all levels gained experience and confidence, learning to exploit their numerical advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. By 1944-1945, Soviet armored forces were formidable opponents capable of conducting sophisticated operations. The German tank commanders who achieved the highest kill counts operated primarily during the middle period of the Eastern Front War, from 1943 to 1944, when they still enjoyed technological and tactical advantages, but faced increasingly desperate situations that provided abundant targets. As Germany transitioned from offensive to defensive operations, tank units found themselves repeatedly engaged in defensive battles where they could use terrain, preparation, and superior gunnery to inflict disproportionate losses on attacking Soviet forces. These conditions, combined with exceptional individual skill, produced the extraordinary records that stunned the world when they became known after the war. The defensive operations that characterized German tank warfare from 1943 onward created particularly favorable conditions for skilled tank commanders to accumulate high kill counts. In defensive positions, German tanks could be placed in carefully selected locations with clear fields of fire, concealment, and prepared routes for withdrawal. They could engage attacking Soviet tanks at maximum range, where German optical and gunnery advantages were greatest. They could coordinate with infantry to protect against enemy infantry infiltration, and with artillery to mass fires on Soviet assembly areas. This integration of advantages multiplied effectiveness far beyond what isolated tanks could achieve. The evolution of Soviet artillery capabilities also influenced tank warfare dynamics. Soviet artillery, organized in massive concentrations, could deliver devastating firepower that forced German tanks to remain mobile and relocate frequently. The famous Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, while inaccurate, created zones of devastation that made static defensive positions untenable. German tank commanders had to balance the advantages of prepared positions against the necessity of remaining mobile to avoid artillery destruction. This added another dimension of complexity to tactical decision-making and increased the skill required for sustained success. The deadliest tank commanders in history were not born warriors but ordinary men transformed by training, combat experience, and the extreme circumstances of the Eastern Front into extraordinarily effective killers. Understanding their achievements requires examining who these men were, how they were trained, and what conditions shaped their development into legends. Kurt Knispel stands as perhaps the most successful tank commander in history, credited with approximately 168 confirmed tank kills and possibly as many as 195 total. Yet Knispel remained relatively unknown compared to some contemporaries because he never received the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration, due to his insubordination and willingness to criticize Nazi ideology. Born in Czechoslovakia in 1921, Knispel was drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1940 and assigned to the armored forces. He served as a gunner and later commander in various units on the Eastern Front, developing a reputation for exceptional shooting accuracy and tactical judgment. Knispel's personality and conduct set him apart from typical German tank aces. He was known for defending Soviet prisoners from mistreatment by SS personnel, a dangerous stance in Nazi Germany's military. He criticized aspects of Nazi racial policy openly enough that his superiors hesitated to nominate him for prestigious awards despite his combat record. His appearance was often unmilitary, with long hair and informal bearing that violated regulations. Yet his skill was so exceptional that he remained in combat roles throughout the war, valued for his ability to destroy enemy tanks, even as his political unreliability prevented formal recognition. His story illustrates how individual excellence could flourish within the Wehrmacht, despite personal characteristics that should have limited advancement in a totalitarian military organization. The fact that Knispel's achievements remain less well known than those of more politically reliable commanders reflects how Nazi propaganda shaped the historical record. The regime wanted heroes who exemplified Nazi values and could be used to inspire the population and military. Knispel's unwillingness to conform to Nazi ideology made him unsuitable for this role, despite his superior combat record. Post-war historical attention has tended to focus on commanders who were celebrated during the war, meaning Knispel's story was partially lost. Only relatively recently have military historians given him appropriate recognition as likely the most successful tank commander in history. Michael Wittmann became the most famous German tank ace, credited with 138 tank kills and 132 other armored vehicle kills. Unlike Knispel, Wittmann received extensive recognition, including the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. Born in Bavaria in 1914, Wittmann joined the SS before the war and served in various capacities before being assigned to tank training. He participated in the invasion of France, Operation Barbarossa, and numerous Eastern Front engagements before being transferred to Normandy in 1944, where he achieved fame for a single-handed attack on British armored forces near Villers-Bocage that destroyed numerous vehicles and temporarily halted an offensive. Wittmann's fame stemmed partly from German propaganda's promotion of him as an exemplar of SS fighting spirit and Aryan martial excellence. His photogenic appearance and willingness to embrace his role as a propaganda symbol made him valuable for morale purposes. Nazi propagandists featured him in newsreels, newspapers, and radio broadcasts, building him into a national hero whose exploits were followed by millions. His death in combat in Normandy in August 1944, when his Tiger tank was destroyed during a battle with British and Canadian forces, was mourned as the loss of a national hero. Post-war revelations about SS atrocities complicated his legacy, raising questions about how to contextualize the achievements of men who served in organizations responsible for war crimes and genocide. The circumstances of Wittmann's death remain somewhat controversial among military historians. His Tiger tank was destroyed during Operation Totalize, a major Canadian offensive south of Caen. Whether it was destroyed by a Canadian Sherman Firefly tank, by a British rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft, or by some combination of fire from multiple sources, remains debated. The quick destruction of Wittmann's tank, despite its formidable armor, illustrated that even the best equipment and most skilled commanders were vulnerable when operating in disadvantageous circumstances against determined opponents with adequate weapons. Otto Carius, credited with over 150 tank kills, survived the war and wrote a memoir that provided detailed insights into tank warfare on the Eastern Front. Born in 1922, Carius joined the German Army in 1940 and trained as a tank crewman. He served on the Eastern Front in various units, participating in defensive battles that characterized German operations from 1943 onward. His memoir, Tigers in the Mud, became one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of German tank warfare, describing tactics, daily life, and the psychological pressures of combat with unusual candor. Carius's post-war life included establishing a pharmacy in Germany that he operated until his death in 2015. He remained unrepentant about his service, arguing that he had been a soldier doing his duty rather than a Nazi ideologue. This stance typified many Wehrmacht veterans who sought to separate their military service from the crimes of the Nazi regime, a distinction that historians have increasingly challenged as evidence accumulated about Wehrmacht complicity in atrocities. Carius's memoir, while valuable as a tactical and operational document, reflected this perspective, focusing on military matters while avoiding engagement with larger moral questions about the war's nature and purposes. The memoir provides extensive detail on the daily realities of tank combat, the physical discomfort of spending hours in cramped, cold or hot compartments, the constant mechanical problems that plagued complex vehicles, the terror of being under artillery fire or facing overwhelming enemy numbers, the exhilaration of successful engagements where skill and preparation resulted in victory. Carius describes specific engagements in detail, explaining tactical decisions, terrain considerations, and the coordination required between crew members. For students of armored warfare tactics, the memoir is invaluable. For those seeking moral reckoning with service to Nazi Germany, it is frustratingly evasive. Johannes Bölter, credited with 139 tank kills, represented another highly successful tank commander whose achievements were recognized with the Knight's Cross. He served primarily on the Eastern Front, participating in defensive battles where German forces attempted to stem Soviet offensives through superior tactics and gunnery. Bölter survived the war and, like Carius, lived a quiet post-war life, avoiding publicity and controversy. His record, like those of other top aces, was achieved primarily while commanding Tiger and Panther tanks that provided significant advantages in long-range gunnery duels. Ernst Bachmann, credited with 82 confirmed tank kills, provides another example of a highly successful tank commander. He served in the SS, particularly in the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and participated in numerous engagements on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Bachmann survived the war and lived quietly until his death in 2009. His lower kill count compared to the very top aces reflects partly that he spent significant time on the Western Front, where opportunities for high kill counts were less abundant than on the Eastern Front. The training that produced these exceptional tank commanders emphasized technical competence, tactical initiative, and combined arms coordination. German tank training programs were extensive, lasting months, and covering every aspect of tank operations. Crewmen learned their specific positions, driver, radio operator, gunner, loader, or commander, through classroom instruction and practical exercises. Gunnery training emphasized accuracy through extensive practice, with crews firing hundreds of practice rounds to develop proficiency in range estimation, target tracking, and trigger control. Tank commanders received additional training in tactics, map reading, communication procedures, and leadership. The German military tradition emphasized Auftragstactik, or mission-type orders, where commanders at all levels were given objectives and expected to use initiative in achieving them rather than waiting for detailed instructions. This approach required confident, competent junior leaders who could make rapid decisions under pressure. Tank commanders were trained to assess situations quickly, identify threats and opportunities, and take action without seeking permission from higher headquarters. The technical capabilities of German tanks provided platforms that rewarded skill and training. German tank optics were generally superior to Soviet equivalents, providing better visibility and more accurate ranging. The Zeiss optics used in German gun sights were precise instruments that, in skilled hands, allowed accurate fire at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. German tanks also typically featured better crew ergonomics, with layouts that facilitated communication and coordination between crew members. These seemingly minor advantages accumulated to provide significant combat effectiveness when combined with superior training. The tactical doctrine Germans employed emphasized several key principles. First, tanks should fight from advantageous positions whenever possible, using terrain, concealment, and prepared positions to maximize their own survivability while minimizing enemy advantages. Second, long-range gunnery was preferred to close-range brawls, exploiting German advantages in optics and gun accuracy to destroy enemies before they could effectively return fire. Third, combined arms coordination was essential, with tanks working closely with infantry, artillery, and air support to create synergistic effects. Fourth, initiative and flexibility were valued over rigid adherence to plans, with commanders expected to exploit opportunities as they arose. These doctrinal principles created conditions where skilled tank commanders could achieve extraordinary results. A well-positioned Tiger tank with a competent crew could engage Soviet tanks at ranges where the T-34's gun was ineffective, destroying multiple targets before being forced to relocate. German tank commanders learned to identify and exploit weak points in Soviet tactical doctrine, such as tendencies to attack along predictable axes or to continue attacks even when suffering heavy casualties. The combination of technological advantage, tactical sophistication, and individual skill produced the conditions for the extraordinary kill counts that characterized the top German tank aces. However, context is essential for understanding these achievements. German tank aces operated in an environment where they faced overwhelming numerical odds. For every tank they destroyed, Soviet factories produced more. Their tactical victories could not overcome strategic realities. Germany was fighting a war it could not win against an enemy with vastly superior resources. Moreover, their service, however professionally competent, contributed to prolonging a war waged for evil purposes. The tank aces were not noble warriors, fighting for just causes, but highly skilled participants in a genocidal conflict. The Soviet tank commanders who opposed them faced different circumstances and developed different characteristics. Soviet aces like Dmitry Lavrinenko, credited with 52 tank kills before his death in 1941, or Zinovy Kolobanov, who reportedly destroyed 22 German tanks in a single engagement, achieved their successes despite inferior equipment and training. Soviet tank commanders who survived long enough to gain experience often became formidable opponents, learning to use terrain, mass, and coordination to offset German technological advantages. The improvement of Soviet tank forces from 1941 to 1945 represented one of the war's most remarkable transformations. Lavrinenko's achievement of 52 kills in approximately 5 months of combat, from July to December 1941, under the most disadvantageous conditions imaginable during the period of greatest Soviet disorganization and equipment inferiority, suggests that exceptional individual skill could produce significant results even without technological advantages. His early death from artillery fire prevented him from potentially achieving kill counts comparable to German aces had he survived into the war's later periods when Soviet tank quality and support improved. The Eastern Front produced tank battles of unprecedented scale and ferocity. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 involved thousands of tanks on both sides and resulted in one of history's largest armored engagements. The Battle of Prokhorovka, part of the larger Kursk operation, saw hundreds of Soviet and German tanks engaged in close-range fighting across a relatively small area. These massive battles provided opportunities for skilled tank commanders to accumulate significant kill counts, but also demonstrated the limits of individual excellence against overwhelming numbers. The Prokhorovka engagement illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of individual tank commander skill. German Tiger and Panther tanks, with their superior long-range gunnery, initially inflicted heavy casualties on attacking Soviet armor. However, Soviet commanders adapted, using terrain and smoke to close range, where their numerical superiority could be brought to bear. The resulting close-quarters battle negated many German technological advantages, with Soviet T-34s able to engage German heavy tanks at ranges where their guns were effective. The battle ended inconclusively in tactical terms, but strategically favored the Soviets, who could replace losses while Germans could not. The winter conditions on the Eastern Front added another dimension of difficulty to tank operations. Extreme cold caused mechanical failures, made metal brittle, and reduced human effectiveness through cold-related injuries and exhaustion. German tanks, designed primarily for temperate European conditions, often struggled in Russian winters. Soviet tanks, designed with winter operations in mind, generally performed better in extreme cold. Tank commanders who operated successfully through multiple winters demonstrated not just combat skill, but also technical knowledge and adaptability necessary to keep complex machines functioning under brutal conditions. The extraordinary kill counts achieved by the deadliest tank commanders in history raise fundamental questions about how we measure combat effectiveness, what these statistics reveal about the nature of armored warfare, and how we should contextualize individual achievement within the broader framework of World War II's moral landscape. The verification of kill claims presents the first major issue. Unlike aerial combat, where crashed aircraft could sometimes be photographed or wreckage recovered, tank kills often occurred in fluid combat situations where precise confirmation was difficult. German procedures required witness statements, typically from other crew members or nearby units, but the chaos of combat made accurate counting challenging. Some commanders likely received credit for tanks that were disabled but not destroyed, or for vehicles abandoned by their crews, but potentially recoverable. The highest-scoring aces claims were probably inflated to some degree, though by how much remains debatable. The German military maintained detailed records of decorations and the achievements that justified them, providing some documentation for kill claims. However, these records served partly as propaganda tools, intended to boost morale and create heroes for public consumption. Commanders seeking decorations for themselves or their subordinates had incentives to inflate claims. Without independent verification, many kill counts cannot be definitively confirmed. This uncertainty does not mean the records are entirely fabricated. The basic pattern of certain commanders achieving exceptional success is well documented, but it suggests caution about treating specific numbers as absolute fact. Soviet records, when they exist, sometimes contradict German claims, showing fewer tanks lost than Germans claim to have destroyed. This discrepancy stems partly from different definitions of loss. Germans might count a tank as destroyed if it was knocked out during a battle, while Soviets might not count it as lost if it was later recovered and repaired. The Eastern Front's fluid nature meant that battlefield control shifted frequently, and both sides recovered and repaired damaged vehicles when possible. A tank counted as destroyed by one side might return to service days or weeks later, unknown to the enemy commander who claimed its destruction. The technological dimension of these achievements deserves careful examination. The deadliest tank commanders almost invariably operated late-war German heavy tanks, particularly Tigers and Panthers, which provided significant advantages in long-range gunnery. The Tiger's 1880mm gun could penetrate Soviet tank armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, while Soviet 70-60mm guns in early T-34s were ineffective against frontal Tiger armor, even at close range. This technological disparity created conditions where a well-positioned Tiger could destroy multiple Soviet tanks with impunity, at least until Soviet forces could bring up heavier guns or maneuver to achieve flanking shots. The question of whether these achievements represented primarily individual skill or technological advantage cannot be answered simply. Both factors mattered. The same Tiger tank in inexperienced hands might achieve far fewer kills, but even the most skilled commander could not achieve comparable results in an obsolete vehicle. The deadliest tank aces combined exceptional personal abilities with the best available tools, operating in circumstances that provided abundant targets. They were neither superhuman warriors achieving success through pure skill, nor mere beneficiaries of superior technology, but rather the result of multiple factors aligning to produce extraordinary effectiveness. The tactical situations that produced high kill counts typically involved defensive operations, where German forces could choose positions, prepare fields of fire, and engage Soviet attacks at advantageous ranges. As Germany transitioned from offensive to defensive operations on the Eastern Front, from 1943 onward, tank units increasingly fought from prepared positions against Soviet offensives. These defensive battles created ideal conditions for skilled tank commanders to maximize their effectiveness. A single, well-positioned tank could control a wide area, destroying multiple attacking vehicles before needing to relocate. The psychological dimension of serving as a tank commander in these circumstances is difficult to comprehend fully. Each engagement meant sending high-velocity shells into enemy vehicles, knowing that each hit likely killed or horribly wounded the crew inside. The successful tank commanders were, by necessity, efficient killers who destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles, meaning they were directly or indirectly responsible for thousands of enemy deaths. How they processed this violence, whether they celebrated their achievements or were haunted by them, varied individually. Some post-war accounts suggest pride in professional competence, coupled with denial about the broader implications of their service. The moral complexity of these achievements becomes unavoidable when we consider what these tank commanders were fighting for. They served Nazi Germany, a regime engaged in genocide and wars of aggression that killed tens of millions. Their tactical successes contributed to prolonging the war and enabling continued atrocities. Even if individual tank commanders were not directly involved in war crimes, though some SS tank units certainly were, their professional competence served evil purposes. This reality complicates any attempt to simply admire their skill or celebrate their achievements without acknowledging the cause they served. The comparison with Allied tank commanders illuminates the Eastern Front's unique character. American and British tank commanders generally achieved far lower kill counts, not because they were less skilled, but because they operated in different circumstances. Western Front tank battles typically occurred in more restricted terrain, involved smaller numbers of vehicles, and featured opponents with training and equipment more comparable to their own. No Allied tank commander came close to the kill counts of top German aces because the opportunities for such achievements simply did not exist in other theaters. The most successful Allied tank commanders typically had kill counts in the single digits or low double digits. This reflected not inferior skill, but different operational circumstances. Western Allied tank units generally operated as part of combined arms teams, where infantry, artillery, and air support shared the burden of destroying enemy armor. The terrain in Western Europe, hedgerows in Normandy, forests in the Ardennes, urban areas throughout, restricted long-range gunnery and prevented the kinds of long-distance engagements where German tank aces excelled. Moreover, German forces in the West were generally deployed more thoughtfully, avoiding the mass tank attacks against prepared positions that characterized Soviet operations on the Eastern Front. Soviet tank commanders, who achieved significant success, did so despite inferior equipment and training, particularly in the war's early years. Their achievements often involved different tactical approaches, emphasizing bold maneuver or close assault, rather than the long-range gunnery that characterized German tactics. Soviet doctrine evolved to incorporate lessons learned from encounters with German tactics, but Soviet tanks never achieved the long-range gunnery capabilities of late-war German vehicles. Soviet success ultimately came through superior numbers, improving quality, and operational level sophistication, rather than through individual tank versus tank combat excellence. The strategic irrelevance of tactical excellence represents another crucial theme. The deadliest tank commanders achieved remarkable individual success, while their nation moved inexorably toward defeat. Each Soviet tank they destroyed was replaced by more from Soviet factories that Germany could not touch. Each tactical victory was a meaningless delay of strategic collapse. The tank aces' achievements, however impressive at the tactical level, could not alter fundamental strategic realities. Germany was outmatched in manpower, industrial capacity, and resources. The war's outcome was determined by factors operating well above the tactical level, where individual tank commanders operated. This strategic context raises questions about the value of individual excellence in warfare. Military organizations celebrate and study the achievements of exceptional individuals because they provide inspiration and instructional value. The tactics employed by successful tank commanders can be analyzed and incorporated into training programs. Their experiences offer insights into what works under combat conditions. Yet the ultimate futility of their efforts from Germany's perspective suggests limitations to what individual excellence can achieve against overwhelming strategic disadvantages. The cultural dimensions of tank warfare deserve consideration as well. The German emphasis on individual achievement and recognition of aces reflected cultural values that emphasized heroism and martial excellence. The Soviet system, by contrast, emphasized collective achievement and was less likely to celebrate individual heroes, at least until later in the war, when propaganda needs encouraged promotion of exceptional individuals. These different cultural approaches shaped how achievements were recorded, recognized, and remembered. The extraordinary effectiveness of history's deadliest tank commanders stemmed from specific tactical approaches, training methods, and operational circumstances that can be analyzed to understand how they achieved such remarkable results. These solutions to the problems of tank warfare on the Eastern Front provide insights into armored combat that remain relevant despite vast changes in technology and doctrine. The foundation of success was superior gunnery. German tank training emphasized accurate shooting through extensive practice and systematic instruction. Gunners learned to estimate range through various methods, including using optical rangefinders, comparing target size to reticle markings in their sights, and developing intuitive judgment through experience. They practiced tracking moving targets, learning to lead them appropriately based on range and relative motion. Most importantly, they learned trigger control, squeezing smoothly rather than jerking to avoid throwing off aim at the critical moment. The technical capabilities of German gun sights and optics magnified training advantages. Zeiss optics provided clear, bright images that allowed gunners to identify and track targets at extended ranges. The gun sights incorporated ballistic compensation, allowing gunners to adjust for range and engage targets accurately at distances where eyeball estimation alone would have been inadequate. These sophisticated optics, combined with trained gunners who understood how to use them, provided German tanks with significant advantages in long-range engagements. Tactical positioning represented another key factor in achieving high kill counts. Successful tank commanders learned to choose positions that maximized their advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. Hull-down positions, where the tank hull was protected by terrain, while the turret remained exposed for observation and firing, were preferred whenever available. This positioning reduced the target presented to enemies while maintaining full offensive capability. Tank commanders also learned to position themselves to take advantage of superior gun range, engaging enemies from distances where return fire was ineffective. The use of terrain went beyond simple positioning to encompass comprehensive battlefield management. Successful tank commanders studied terrain before engagements, identifying good firing positions, covered routes for relocation, and likely enemy approaches. They prepared multiple positions so they could move after engaging to avoid return fire or flanking attempts. They coordinated with infantry to ensure that enemy infantry armed with anti-tank weapons could not approach their positions. This systematic approach to terrain management multiplied combat effectiveness enormously. Communication and coordination with other units represented crucial advantages that German doctrine emphasized. Tank commanders maintained radio contact with supporting infantry, artillery, and other tanks, coordinating combined arms teams that were far more effective than isolated individual vehicles. When tank commanders identified targets beyond their ability to engage, they could call for artillery support. When enemy infantry threatened their positions, they could request infantry support for clearing operations. This integration of capabilities made German armored units more effective than their equipment alone would suggest. The targeting priorities employed by successful tank commanders reflected sophisticated tactical judgment. Rather than simply shooting at whatever appeared first, experienced commanders learned to identify and prioritize threats. Enemy tanks armed with guns capable of penetrating German armor received priority over lighter vehicles. Tanks in positions to flank or threaten friendly forces took precedence over tanks engaged with other German units. Command vehicles, identifiable by additional antennas, were high-value targets whose destruction disrupted enemy coordination. This systematic approach to target selection maximized the impact of each shot. The technique of engaging multiple targets efficiently required extensive training and experience. After destroying one enemy tank, successful commanders immediately shifted to acquire new targets rather than watching their first kill or celebrating. They developed systematic scan patterns that allowed them to track multiple threats simultaneously and engage them in rapid succession. Loaders trained to reload guns at maximum speed enabled high rates of fire when multiple targets presented themselves. The crew coordination necessary to achieve this required hundreds of hours of training and combat experience working together. The tactical withdrawal represented another skill that separated successful tank commanders from those who achieved initial success before being destroyed. Knowing when to break off an engagement and relocate was crucial for survival. Commanders learned to recognize when enemy forces were maneuvering to flank their positions, when enemy artillery was ranging in on them, or when they risked being cut off by advancing enemy forces. The ability to disengage cleanly and reposition to continue fighting extended career length and allowed accumulation of higher kill counts over multiple engagements. Maintenance and mechanical reliability, while less dramatic than tactical factors, significantly influenced long-term effectiveness. Tank commanders who insisted on proper maintenance procedures, who did not abuse their vehicles through unnecessary wear, and who developed good working relationships with their maintenance crews, kept their tanks operational for higher percentages of time. Tanks that broke down frequently could not achieve combat success regardless of crew skill. The most successful commanders understood that professional excellence included mundane matters like track maintenance and engine care. The aggressive but calculated risk-taking that characterized top tank commanders represented a difficult balance to achieve. They were willing to accept risks to achieve results, but avoided foolish exposure that would get them killed to no purpose. This judgment developed through experience and natural aptitude, with some commanders demonstrating better tactical intuition than others. The tank aces who survived long enough to accumulate extraordinary kill counts had either exceptional luck or exceptional judgment about when to be bold and when to be cautious. The solutions these commanders developed for the tactical problems they faced were not universal panaceas. They worked in the specific context of the Eastern Front, where German tanks generally enjoyed technological advantages and where Soviet tactical doctrine in the early and middle war years provided exploitable weaknesses. As Soviet capabilities improved and German advantages eroded, these tactics became less effective. By late 1944 and 1945, Soviet numerical superiority was so overwhelming, and Soviet tactical sophistication had improved so much that individual German tank commander skill mattered less than earlier in the war. The instructional value of studying these tactics lies not in assuming they can be directly applied to modern armored warfare, but in understanding principles that transcend specific technologies and circumstances. Superior gunnery, tactical positioning, terrain management, combined arms coordination, Systematic target prioritization, crew teamwork, proper maintenance, and calibrated risk-taking remain relevant to armored operations today, even though specific implementation differs dramatically from World War II. Modern tank warfare, when it occurs, involves fundamentally different circumstances. Precision-guided munitions, attack helicopters, and unmanned aerial vehicles create threat environments unimaginable in World War II. Modern main battle tanks incorporate sophisticated fire control computers, composite armor, and active protection systems that transform the character of armored combat. Yet the human elements, judgment, training, coordination, tactical sense, remain central to effectiveness. Studying how exceptional individuals achieved remarkable results with the tools available to them provides insights that transcend specific eras and technologies. The celebration of history's deadliest tank commanders as exceptional warriors demands critical examination from multiple perspectives: historical accuracy, moral implications, tactical relevance, and the broader meaning of individual combat achievement in modern warfare. These critiques do not dismiss the reality of what these commanders achieved, but contextualize their records within frameworks that complicate simple admiration. The historical accuracy of kill count claims remains fundamentally uncertain. The verification procedures used during the war were inadequate by modern standards, relying on witness testimony from participants with incentives to inflate numbers. The chaos of combat, where disabled tanks might be counted as destroyed and later recovered, where abandoned vehicles might be claimed as kills, and where multiple claimants might report the same destruction, created conditions for significant overcounting. Post-war research comparing German claims to Soviet loss records consistently shows discrepancies, with Germans claiming more enemy losses than Soviets acknowledged suffering. The inflation of kill counts served propaganda purposes for Nazi Germany, which needed heroes to maintain morale as the strategic situation deteriorated. Tank aces like Michael Wittmann received extensive publicity, with their achievements highlighted in newspapers, newsreels, and radio broadcasts. This propaganda value created pressure on the military to confirm and publicize high kill counts even when evidence was ambiguous. Officers responsible for verifying claims understood that questioning the records of celebrated aces would be unpopular and might harm their own careers. These structural incentives bias the system toward inflation. Individual tank commanders may also have had personal incentives to inflate claims. Decorations and promotions often depended on demonstrated achievement, and kill counts provided quantifiable metrics for assessing effectiveness. Commanders seeking recognition had motives to claim generous credit for ambiguous situations. While many tank commanders were undoubtedly honest in their reporting, the system lacked adequate checks against deliberate or unconscious exaggeration. The result is that specific kill count numbers should be treated with skepticism, even while acknowledging that the general pattern of exceptional effectiveness was real. The moral dimension of celebrating these commanders remains deeply problematic. They served Nazi Germany, fighting to extend Hitler's genocidal empire across Eastern Europe. The Holocaust proceeded in areas German forces controlled, with Wehrmacht units sometimes directly involved in atrocities and almost always aware of them. Tank units operating on the Eastern Front moved through regions where mass murders of Jews and other targeted populations occurred regularly. Even if individual tank commanders were not personally involved in these crimes, their military success enabled them by prolonging German control of occupied territories. The post-war efforts by many Wehrmacht veterans to portray themselves as honorable soldiers distinct from the SS and Nazi Party have been systematically dismantled by historical research. The Wehrmacht was not a clean force engaged in conventional military operations while atrocities were committed by others. Wehrmacht units participated in or facilitated mass murder, enforced brutal occupation policies, and implemented criminal orders like the Commissar Order that mandated execution of Soviet political officers. Individual tank commanders who claimed they were just soldiers doing their duty cannot escape the reality that their duty served monstrous purposes. The specific case of SS tank commanders like Michael Wittmann adds additional moral complications. The SS was not merely a military organization, but the primary instrument of Nazi genocide. SS membership implied commitment to Nazi ideology, and SS units were directly involved in numerous atrocities on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. Celebrating SS tank commanders for their tactical effectiveness without acknowledging their service in a genocidal organization represents a profound moral failure. Their combat skills, however impressive, were employed in service of the Holocaust and Nazi imperialism. The tactical relevance of World War II tank combat to modern warfare is limited, despite persistent military interest in studying historical engagements. Modern main battle tanks bear little resemblance to World War II vehicles. They incorporate sophisticated fire control computers that automatically compensate for range, relative motion, and environmental factors, making accurate shooting far easier than manual gunnery required. They feature composite armor, reactive armor, and active protection systems that make them far more survivable than World War II tanks. They operate in networked environments with real-time intelligence and comprehensive battlefield awareness, unknown to earlier generations. The operational context of modern armored warfare also differs fundamentally from the Eastern Front. The mass tank battles involving thousands of vehicles that characterized operations like Kursk have not occurred since World War II and seem unlikely to occur in future conflicts. Modern anti-tank weapons, particularly precision-guided munitions and attack helicopters, make large armored formations extremely vulnerable. Tank warfare has evolved from being central to military operations to being one element in complex combined arms systems, where armor plays important but not dominant roles. The tactics that produced high kill counts in World War II would likely be suicidal in modern combat. The question of what these extraordinary kill counts reveal about human nature in combat settings deserves consideration. The deadliest tank commanders were efficient killers who destroyed hundreds of vehicles and killed or wounded thousands of enemy soldiers. How they processed this violence psychologically, whether they celebrated it or were traumatized by it, whether they saw enemies as human beings or as targets, remains poorly documented. Post-war memoirs generally avoid deep psychological introspection, focusing instead on tactical matters and unit esprit de corps. But the reality of repeatedly killing other human beings, even in contexts where such killing is socially sanctioned and legally permissible, must have had profound psychological effects. Some tank commanders may have been natural warriors who enjoyed combat and took pride in their effectiveness without moral qualms. Others may have been troubled by violence even while performing their duties effectively. Still others may have developed psychological defenses that allowed them to compartmentalize their combat actions and avoid confronting moral implications. The diversity of human psychology suggests that different commanders experience their roles differently, but all face the reality of being professional killers, and the psychological cost of that role likely affected them all in various ways. The strategic futility of tactical excellence represents a critique that applies beyond just the deadliest tank commanders to military excellence generally in losing causes. Germany lost the war decisively, despite having exceptionally skilled tank commanders, infantry leaders, pilots, and staff officers. Superior tactical performance could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages in resources, industrial capacity, geography, and alliance structures. This reality suggests limits to the value of individual excellence in warfare when strategic fundamentals favor the enemy. Military organizations must balance investment in developing exceptional individuals against attention to strategic-level factors that ultimately determine outcomes. The gender dimension of tank warfare deserves brief mention. Combat tank crews in World War II were exclusively male in all major combatant nations, reflecting societal gender norms that excluded women from direct combat roles. Modern militaries increasingly include women in combat positions, including armor, raising questions about whether the all-male character of historical tank crews reflected inherent requirements or merely cultural assumptions. The physical demands of World War II tanks, particularly loading heavy shells in cramped conditions, were substantial but not beyond female capabilities. The evolution toward greater gender integration in modern armored forces suggests that the historical exclusion of women reflected social constructs rather than military necessity. The racial dimensions of Nazi ideology and how they influenced Wehrmacht operations cannot be ignored when discussing German tank commanders. Nazi racial theory categorized Slavs as inferior peoples, suitable for enslavement or extermination. This ideology shaped occupation policies and contributed to the brutal character of warfare on the Eastern Front. Tank commanders operating in this context were not isolated from these attitudes. Whether individual commanders embraced, rejected, or were indifferent to Nazi racial ideology varied, but all operated within a system premised on racial hierarchy and genocidal objectives. The world's stunned reaction to learning about the extraordinary kill counts achieved by history's deadliest tank commanders reflects broader discomfort with celebrating exceptional effectiveness in service of evil causes. These men were undeniably skilled, operating in circumstances that rewarded competence with survival and accumulation of impressive records. They mastered the technical aspects of gunnery, the tactical dimensions of positioning and maneuver, and the psychological challenges of repeatedly facing death while inflicting it on others. Their achievements represented the apex of individual combat effectiveness in armored warfare during an era when such effectiveness mattered more than it would in subsequent conflicts. Yet admiration for their skill must be balanced against recognition of what they fought for. These tank commanders served Nazi Germany, contributing their exceptional abilities to prolonging a war waged for genocidal purposes. Their tactical victories enabled strategic evil, delaying German defeat and allowing additional time for the Holocaust and other atrocities to continue. The moral calculus of individual excellence in service of collective evil admits no easy resolution. We can acknowledge their competence while condemning their cause, but the tension between these positions remains fundamentally uncomfortable. The specific individuals who achieved the highest kill counts were products of their circumstances. German training and doctrine that emphasized initiative and excellence, technological advantages that rewarded skill with effectiveness, and the Eastern Front's unique character that provided abundant targets and desperate fighting. Remove any of these elements, and their records would have been far different. They were neither superhuman warriors nor merely lucky beneficiaries of superior equipment, but rather the result of multiple advantages aligning to produce extraordinary results. Their post-war lives reflected varying responses to their wartime service. Some, like Otto Carius, wrote memoirs and lived publicly, defending their service as honorable military duty divorced from Nazi ideology. Others, like Kurt Knispel, remained obscure, their achievements unrecognized even by those interested in military history. Michael Wittmann died in combat, spared the need to reconcile his service to the SS with post-war moral reckonings. None could escape the fundamental reality that their professional excellence served monstrous purposes, however they chose to frame their service. The tactical lessons from their achievements remain instructive, despite vast changes in technology and doctrine. Superior training matters. Accurate gunnery provides decisive advantages. Tactical positioning multiplies effectiveness. Combined arms coordination produces synergistic results. Maintenance and reliability enable sustained operations. These principles transcend specific weapons systems and remain relevant to modern armored warfare, even though implementation differs dramatically from World War II. The strategic irrelevance of tactical excellence deserves emphasis as a counterweight to celebrating individual combat achievement. Germany produced numerous exceptionally skilled tank commanders, infantry leaders, pilots, and staff officers, yet lost the war decisively. Individual brilliance could not overcome strategic fundamentals. Germany fought a multi-front war against enemies with vastly superior combined resources, industrial capacity, and manpower. The deadliest tank commanders delayed defeat, but could not prevent it. Their records, however impressive, represent tactical footnotes to strategic collapse. The human cost of these records must not be forgotten beneath the statistics. Each destroyed tank typically meant multiple dead or wounded crew members. The deadliest tank commanders were responsible, directly or indirectly, for thousands of deaths. These were not abstractions, but human beings, Soviet soldiers, many conscripted, fighting to defend their homeland against invasion. They died horrible deaths, burned alive or blown apart, because they encountered exceptionally skilled opponents. Celebrating the skill that killed them requires acknowledging the human cost of that effectiveness. The Soviet tank commanders who opposed the German aces also deserve recognition. They fought with inferior equipment, inadequate training, and tactical doctrine that often sent them to pointless deaths, yet they persevered, learning through bitter experience, improving their skills, and ultimately prevailing through sheer determination and overwhelming numbers. Soviet tankers who survived long enough to gain experience often became formidable opponents, demonstrating that individual excellence was not a German monopoly. Their achievements, though generally involving lower individual kill counts, were accomplished despite greater obstacles and in service of defeating genuine evil. The moral complexity of World War II tank warfare on the Eastern Front admits no simple conclusions. The conflict combined exceptional individual skill with industrial-scale slaughter, tactical brilliance with strategic monstrousness, and human courage on both sides, serving vastly different moral causes. The deadliest tank commanders demonstrated what humans can achieve when training, equipment, circumstance, and individual ability align optimally. That these achievements occurred in service of Nazi Germany complicates but does not erase the reality of their effectiveness. The world was stunned when these records became known because they seemed almost impossible. Kill counts so high, they resembled video game scores more than reality. The skepticism such numbers provoke is healthy and appropriate. Many claims were likely inflated, but the fundamental pattern, certain German tank commanders achieved extraordinary effectiveness through skill, training, and technological advantage while fighting on the Eastern Front, is well established. Understanding how they achieved such results provides insights into armored warfare that remain valuable despite the moral stain of the cause they served. The lesson for military professionals studying these records is that technical and tactical excellence matters enormously at the operational level, but cannot substitute for strategic wisdom. Organizations can and should train their personnel to the highest possible standards, provide them with the best available equipment, and foster cultures that reward initiative and professionalism. But they must also ensure that strategic decision-making maintains perspective about what tactical excellence can achieve and at what cost. The deadliest tank commanders could not save Germany because Germany's strategic position was fundamentally hopeless. Their achievements represent warning about assuming tactical prowess can overcome strategic blunders. The broader lesson for understanding military history is that individual achievement in warfare occurs within moral and strategic contexts that must not be ignored. We can study the tactics that produced extraordinary effectiveness without celebrating the men who employed them or the cause they served. We can acknowledge their skill while condemning their choices to put that skill at Nazi Germany's disposal. We can learn from their techniques while rejecting the purposes to which those techniques were applied. This nuanced approach preserves instructional value while maintaining moral clarity. The families who lost loved ones to these exceptionally effective tank commanders never knew they faced opponents whose skill placed them among the deadliest combatants in history. They knew only that husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers went to war and did not return. Each of those losses represented a universe of grief, regardless of whether death came from an anonymous average soldier or from a legendary tank ace. From the perspective of those who mourned, the killer's identity and skill level were irrelevant. This human dimension grounds discussions of combat effectiveness in the reality of war's costs. The technological trajectory from World War II tanks to modern main battle tanks illustrates how dramatically armored warfare has evolved. A Tiger tank from 1943, formidable in its era, would be utterly helpless against a modern M1 Abrams or Leopard 2. The sophistication of fire control systems, armor protection, mobility, and situational awareness has increased by orders of magnitude. Yet human factors, training, judgment, courage, teamwork, remain central to effectiveness. The best technology operated by poorly trained crews achieves far less than adequate technology operated by skilled professionals. This continuity across eras validates studying how exceptional individuals achieved remarkable results with the tools available to them. The question of whether we should remember these tank commanders as heroes, villains, or complex figures, admitting no simple categorization, depends on what we seek from historical engagement. Those looking for inspirational figures to emulate will be disappointed, and perhaps should be. Those seeking to understand how individuals achieved remarkable effectiveness in specific circumstances will find valuable insights. Those examining moral implications of service to evil regimes will find cautionary tales. History provides whatever we bring to it, disciplined curiosity that acknowledges complexity rather than seeking simplistic narratives. The Eastern Front tank battles that produced these extraordinary kill counts occurred in a specific place and time that will never be replicated. The scale of operations, the intensity of combat, the technological disparities, and the strategic circumstances were unique to that conflict. Future armored warfare, if it occurs at all in an era of precision-guided munitions and unmanned systems, will look dramatically different. But the human elements, courage, fear, skill, training, judgment, leadership, remain constant across eras. Studying how these elements combined in history's deadliest tank commanders provides insights into human performance under extreme stress that transcends specific technologies and tactics. The world's stunned reaction to these records reflected recognition that individual humans, in the right circumstances, can achieve effectiveness that seems to defy probability. These tank commanders destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles through combinations of skill, training, technology, and circumstance that may never align so perfectly again. Their achievements stand as testaments to what humans can accomplish when pushed to their limits in combat. That these accomplishments served monstrous purposes does not erase their reality, but does demand that we remember them with appropriate moral gravity, rather than uncritical admiration. The final word belongs not to celebration or condemnation, but to somber recognition of what these records represent: exceptional individual effectiveness in service of collective evil, tactical brilliance insufficient to overcome strategic folly, and human skill demonstrated through industrial-scale killing. The deadliest tank commanders in history remind us that excellence and evil can coexist, that skill serves purposes beyond itself, and that moral judgment of individual achievement must account for the causes to which that achievement contributed. Their records stunned the world when revealed because they forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human capability, the nature of modern warfare, and the moral complexities of evaluating individual achievement within contexts of collective atrocity. These lessons remain relevant as long as humans study war and grapple with its implications for civilization and morality.